And first up is Tony D'Amato. It's all yours, Tony.
Thanks, Austin, and thanks, folks, for logging in. I'm Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Brian Palick from the Forest Service Northern Research Station, who certainly has contributed a lot to the ideas I'm about to showcase here in this brief 10-minute spiel. What my goal is really in this session is that we're talking about advancing the field of silviculture and certainly building on recent advancements. And so my role really is to talk a bit about ecological silviculture, which some might view as a newer advancement in our discipline, and how many of the outcomes that occur, particularly at the stand level through silvicultural interventions under this system, really fit with some emerging objectives around global change adaptation, things that will be talked about quite a bit throughout the session. But before I get into kind of talking about kind of how we're seeing ecological silviculture today, it's worth just reflecting on the origins of ecological silviculture. And the reason for that is if we really are to advance silviculture and move forward, there's a lot to be learned in terms of how these big jumps in practice and approaches have occurred in the past. And most folks, when we talk about origins of ecological silviculture, likely think of the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s and 90s and the timber wars and the Northwest Forest Plan, all these things that came together and really pushed forward different ideas around new forestry and how to manage forests for multiple taxa and objectives. But those that have wasted their time digging into the literature on this, which is one of maybe a few of us, really find that the first kind of codification of ideas around ecological silviculture came from the Northeast, and in particular came from the Harvard Forest. And really a lot of the ideas around ecological silviculture came from the notion that working against the site, working against natural dynamics, really was futile in terms of getting desired silvicultural outcomes. And that if we really wanted to have the most effectiveness in terms of compositional and structural goals, we should try to emulate nature as close as possible. And so those that have ever read this paper or noticed even on this slide, kind of when it was published, 1942, a publication that says silviculture following natural models in the 1940s was probably the worst possible timing ever in terms of these are great ideas, but what society was demanding at that time was lots of wood and lots of wood fast. And so ecological silviculture really did not become popularized until, from a broader policy and societal perspective, it became a desired outcome. And that really was in the 1980s and 1990s in the Pacific Northwest. And so there's a lot to be learned in terms of both having good silvicultural ideas scientifically, but also their transferability to what society is asking for at a given time. And so if we look at kind of how we define ecological silviculture today, it really does integrate those historic roots, so this understanding of natural dynamics, but also its contemporary application in that we're trying to achieve integrated environmental, economic, and social outcomes. And so the key principles that we're trying to emulate with ecological silviculture really boiled down into four kind of key principles. One being kind of when we're doing silvicultural interventions, we're really focusing in on managing for continuity between pre and post-harvest conditions whenever we're doing regeneration harvest. And this is often what most people ascribe all ecological silviculture to being, is just retaining things at harvest. That's one snapshot of the bigger pool of things we're going for. Second, that silvicultural interventions are creating and maintaining structural complexity and species diversity at multiple spatial scales, particularly within stand. And that's what I'm going to talk a lot about for the remainder, how that spatial patterning really influences adaptation potential. Likewise, that our timing, so both harvest entries, so thinning intervals, cutting cycles, rotation ages are being done in ways that are ecologically relevant, so that we're thinking about how long it takes to grow a certain size tree, or how long it takes for a dispersal limited taxa to establish a population on a site. And so thinking about that timing. And then finally, how does that accumulate over the landscape? So the context of those applications and the functional linkages that might occur through time. And so if we were to boil down a lot of what ecological silviculture has been trying to accomplish, is that in many cases, it's pushing against what were the traditional desired conditions of silviculture. And in particular, those of us that teach silviculture or just like to read silviculture textbooks, it's a huge population of people I know, when you find those conditions that were viewed as the desired condition of traditional silvicultural approaches, many things like balanced, normal, uniform, well-stocked, regulated, those are the adjectives we often use to describe those conditions. And in many cases, what that is reflecting is this desire to have this top-down command and control approach to silviculture that's really creating a uniform condition that's going to produce and sustain wood products at a fairly predictable outcome. The undesirable conditions and adjectives we find in silviculture textbooks are things like irregular, unbalanced, under and overstocked, overmature, all things that, again, historically we're speaking to a condition that was not predictable, hard to control, and ironically, oftentimes many foresters were encountering in natural stands. And so when we look at ecological silviculture and many of the adjectives that have become popular with it, like variable, complex, and irregular, they are really trying to embrace and emulate many of those historic undesirable outcomes of stand level silviculture. And so what that's really led to in terms of applications of ecological silviculture are practices that within stand are creating a lot of heterogeneity. And some have often argued really creating these micro stands within a stand. And historic justification for doing this from an ecological silviculture standpoint is that we're trying to maintain and restore native species diversity. And so by restoring that complexity within stand in terms of different densities, different opening sizes, different resource environments, we're creating this habitat-rich space that has many different opportunities for different species to persist, recover, and disperse over time. But what I'm going to finish up this presentation talking about is those sand conditions that within stand heterogeneity in forest conditions really creates a lot of opportunities as well as we think about dealing with the challenges of global change. And so one example, looking at this variable retention harvest from above, this is all red pine, so same species just retained across an area. And so we have different densities and spatial arrangements, which again, historically would be for different habitats for different species and connectivity and so forth. But if we look at this through the lens of the climate responses currently present in those populations of trees, even though it's the same species, we've done work that's shown these high density areas have very different temperature responses and very different moisture responses than trees that are going to be in these low density areas. And so in particular, fall temperature and August precip being very important for the trees in these high density areas. And these low density stands, really the most important thing in these forests, which are not arid systems, are what they're experiencing in terms of fall temps and the level of non-structural carbohydrates they're expiring at that time of year. And then likewise, these moderate density areas are responding to an even different climate cue. And so by creating this within stand heterogeneity, both in size and density, which again, historically was driven by habitat and aesthetics and other goals, is also creating this complexity in climate and disturbance response, really compatible with what we're trying to do with adaptation. Likewise, those familiar with the work that Andrew Larson and Derek Churchill and others have done, there's been a lot of work that's looked at how tree spatial pattern, although often emphasized from an ecological restoration standpoint, also has a strong influence in terms of what we're seeing in terms of adaptive response of those ecosystems over time. So this top panel shows kind of a uniformly thinned ponderosa pine stand, fuel reduction treatment. Nothing wrong with that approach, but this uniformity really has created uniformity in the vulnerability of that forest to drought, wind, and fire, as well as a uniform environment for regeneration. So if we think about the functional traits that are favored by that environment, it's a pretty limited scope of traits. Whereas the picture below is an area that was restored following natural models, trying to emulate that complexity and spatial structure that we might see following a mixed severity fire regime. And so what this has created is within that stand, quite a bit of variability, both in the drought, wind, and fire vulnerability, as well as multiple regeneration environments for species to establish and persist across the site. And so that within stand heterogeneity, again, that ecological silviculture is trying to create and historically was being driven by biodiversity objectives also transfers into these adaptation goals going forward. So the final point being, we can't just use natural systems as our guide. And a lot of us are thinking through, well, how do we actually integrate future conditions and trying to plant possibly future adapted species across the landscape, and something that will be talked about more throughout this session, different genotypes, different functional traits. How do we introduce those into our landscapes and do it in a way that might allow those systems to have more options for adaptation? And so as one example, we're looking at a landscape here. This is a LiDAR image, so hotter colors, just taller trees. And so this magenta polygon here, this is an area being treated with variable density thinning. And so much of this stand is remaining. We're not clear cutting the stand and replanting it with future forests. But what we're doing is within kind of ecologically relevant microstands, introducing some of those functional traits, some of those future adapted genotypes to provide these kind of key nodes of adaptation going forward. And so having that diversity of microstands created by ecological silviculture really creates this key template for many of these interactions to occur over time. And so by creating places where these species are established, that'll then interact with gaps and other conditions across that site and really create those functional complex networks that Messi and others have been arguing for, but doing it within stands and across stands, as opposed to thinking about this as kind of a uniform stand condition across the site. So in my last 30 seconds I'm allowed here, I think there's a lot to be gained just even looking at like our future silviculture. Well, how did this last kind of novel silviculture come about? And I would argue that a lot of the ideas were already kind of codified in the 40s and 50s, but nobody really was interested in those ideas from a broader societal and policy perspective. And it wasn't until the 80s and the timber wars and all the things that happened in the Northwest that people finally said, hey, this ecological silviculture thing kind of links with what we're asking for from a societal perspective, as well as from an ecological standpoint. And so what's useful, I think, beyond just the evolution of ecological silviculture is that the outcomes of ecological silviculture, in particular, the generation of these microstands and that complexity in resource environments and functional conditions, really provides a very useful infrastructure for building these adaptation objectives going forward. And so providing those cross-scale linkages that I think are so important as we're really striving to gain these emerging ecosystem properties for adaptation. So I'll stop with that. I'm 30 seconds over based on my timer. Sorry, Austin, and I'll turn it over to our next presenter.
Thank you. So a very nice introduction to what I'm going to present today. This is a collaborative work with Nuria Ekule, Elise Filiola, Marco Mina, and Christian Messier. So basically, this is a work where several years in the making, where we try to see how can we combine network theory with functional trade to improve forest resilience in the face of global change. And all those global change we know in borough forests, mainly we used to think of fire, but also insect outbreaks are common throughout the different type of forest types. And in area more where I am in Toronto, there's a lot of land use change, and we are creating those kind of forest remain throughout the country of different sizes and different spacing between them. So we can think of forests as a series of forest stands that are having different sizes. And now I represent them with those red circles. So we can say this is a forest stand, another forest stand, depending on the composition and the age. And we can see that as a node that can be think of as a node in a network of forests. So basically the link between those forests could be that we do plantation. So we are moving the seed, or the stands are close enough so there could be a natural seed regeneration by wind dispersal or animal dispersal of the seeds. So this composition of mosaic of stand can be portrayed and simplified into a concept of networks. Oops. And that's bring to the framework that Christian Messier proposed in 2019 with many of us to manage forests for resilience in incorporating two aspects, the functional trait of the species and the forest layout of the stand. So to manipulate the stand within stand, like the previous speaker mentioned, but also across the landscape. So the first step will be to do the management at the stand level and see what is the current species diversity. So the richness in this case is 2, the functional diversity is high, but there's no really redundancy in the system, versus maybe what we could do with plantation to enrich a stand is to have more species diversity. Then there's not only what is happening within a stand, but the layout of those forest stand in the landscape. And maybe we could add through forest management some kind of enrichment of each stand by planting or adding new areas, new plantation in area where there was no forest. So this is the red polygon here. So we can manipulate the management to improve the dispersal ability. So the link between those patch of forest is to show how big the transfer of seed can occur. So here we have more centralized patches that can spread seed to the adjacent one. So all that can be achieved by some kind of specific management practices, and then through a modeling framework we can see how they are resistant through different disturbance that occur in the landscape or will occur in the future, so insect outbreak, climate change, and harvesting practices. So to do this properly, we need to understand what are the network property and the functional traits of the species. So here we have this kind of network theory 101 that I can offer to you. So basically what we see is the network, what it is a conceptual representation where we have node, in our case is forest stand, and the relationship is the dispersal ability or connection interaction between those nodes. There's different other ways in which you may have heard of networks. So there's ecological food web, there's species interaction, there's kind of trophic level interaction. But the network that are of interest to us here is the spatial layout of the stands and how there's a hierarchy. So there's a processes at one stand and processes at upper scale. So we call that a network of network, or lately people call it just meta network. So then what are we going to try to maintain in a landscape with our management practices is to make sure that there's a good connectivity between each stand, and that can be measured about how many times a forest stand is used by other or is positioned in the network, how it favor the movement. So this is known as the centrality measure. So here C and D have very high centrality because they are in the middle of the network and the external patches don't have as much centrality. Then connectivity is to assess the number of patches and the number link that the patch has. And then the modularity is by fragmentation and harvesting, how much sub-network are we constructing so that there are too isolated to recolonize one another. Then there's the functional traits of interest. So here, the study that I'm presenting is from this paper from Nuria Ekute in Ecological Application. This region was about 7,000 square meters. That is mostly agriculture landscape with 40% of forest patches of temperate forest. And then there was validation at 42 sites where we knew that there were 34 species of varying abundance that could be regrouped into 8 functional traits. And the trait that I'm going to present today is the trait about drought tolerance index, as the previous author also presented. So here what we want to see is how fragmented this landscape is. We could see already the dark region are forested, the light region are agriculture ones, and there would be different regional land cover types and forest stand composition in this region. So based on that, we can apply at the landscape level our network matrix. So the centrality, connectivity, and modularity. So here, bigger the circle, more central those patches are, because they are at the center of the landscape. But all those little dots are forest stands that are more in peripheral, that are not as central to the connectivity. The links are all the connection between the stand, and the color represent the functional diversity, how much diversity they have. So more blue, more diverse, purple less, and yellow less diverse function of the stand forest. So we can represent this functionality in terms of tree redundancy and diversity versus connectivity using those radar plots. So we have the connectivity index and then the functional redundancy and diversity aspect. This is to show what would be the species response if we were changing by plantation and having trees that are more drought tolerance, pest tolerance, or improving the biodiversity. So here we see those radar plots. So it's a little bit hard to see, but in essence, what we have is this first reference, the original of the landscape, how it was. So it was already not really much connected. There was not many stands that were having centrality, or there was not much modularity. This thing, we don't want too much modularity. And then we cannot really differentiate in the beginning the tree composition that are resistant to drought pests, but we can see a big effect of harvesting that create more modularity. So let's see now if we improve this region by adding some kind of trees. So we can have two ways to do the improvement of the stand: by adding new patches. So this would be the mixed plantation in red, or the existing stand, we can enrich them. So those are the two things we're going to oppose here. So this is the kind of result. So what has been done here is I'm showing you only the stand where there's been enrichment. And again, in blue is the reference original layout of the forest and composition in the landscape. And the tree treatment was to add 10,000 hectare, 40,000 hectare, or 70,000 hectare of plantation, and how that changed the index, those 5 index. So by adding, regardless the amount, we shift the, it's not anymore redundant, but we increase the diversity in terms of tree composition because we want to favor drought tolerant trees. We improve the centrality, connectivity, and we did not improve modularity, so that the things are still connected as much as possible. So this was when we focus only in the functional enrichment stand. And then when we add plantation, we could have a better assessment where to put them to improve all those different factors. So again, with the original, we see it better in blue here, it's here, but it's hiding by the adding 10%, 10,000 hectare. So what we see is that it's kind of similar than the previous original landscape, but when we have 40 or 70,000 hectare, we can see that we can shift again the centrality and the diversity. So overall, this is a good showcase that we are able to change the landscape to improve its dynamic. And we found that we are able to improve the connectivity, the resilience of this region by managing in terms of both a functional network that include tree traits and connectivity. So it's a win-win strategy that is improving both diversity and connectivity, and that a mix of stand enrichment and plantation is the best way to cope here with drought. Given that I had only 10 minutes, I just want to say that now we can have that dynamic with a model, and this is the work with Marco Mina. There are several papers where we did that. And I think the key message is we need to look at the interplay between those kind of species traits and the landscape topology of the stand to better maintain the functional dynamic of the forest, and that we need to look at the temporal dimension as well through modeling to ensure the tolerance of the forest function, again, as the previous author mentioned. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so the name of my talk, my name is Austin Himes. I'm from Mississippi State University, where I work in silviculture, ecosystem services, and environmental values. I'll be talking about all 3 of those things today in my talk, which is silviculture for multiple ecosystem services and values. I added the subtitle of more than changing objectives, as I've given trends on this presentation in the past. I had people come up to me and say, this is good, but it's really just about changing the focus in what our management objectives are. I hope today, or at least maybe through the discussion, understand why I think it's more than just changing objectives. So while a little cliche, I think it's helpful to review very quickly what we mean by silviculture. Following the Society of American Foresters definition, it's the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forests and woodlands to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners and society on a sustainable basis. We also often think of it or teach our students in silviculture classes that it is dependent on a cycle where we have tending, regeneration, and harvest methods, and usually a system that composes this cycle is named after those regeneration methods. What I would propose is that we shift our understanding of silviculture to more embrace the ecosystem services model. Specifically, I like to work from what's called the ecosystem service cascades model, which starts with the biophysical structures and processes that make up a forest ecosystem, and a subset of those that are specifically of interest to humans because their ability to help produce ecosystem services are called ecosystem functions. And these functions, like tree growth, then cascade down and provide ecosystem services like timber production for people that results in benefits to people. Now, since people are receiving benefits from forests, there is a tendency for us to exert pressures on these systems. Examples of this through the history of forestry would be extractive or exploitive harvest practices. And those pressures can alter the biophysical structures of the ecosystem. And in order to be sustainable, it's necessary to assert policy or other interventions to assure that those ecosystems are able to continue to provide that downward flow that eventually provides ecosystem services and benefits to people. Now, this is the sort of traditional ecosystem service cascade model that was first introduced or included in the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. But in the last 20 years, there have been some modifications. The first of those is that there's explicit recognition ecosystem services don't just fall into our laps, but actually require quite a bit of human co-production. That is, we have to invest time, money, and resources to mobilize those before we get benefits. Trees might grow on their own, but unless we harvest and manage for them, we don't get the timber and hence the benefits from forests if we're talking about timber benefits. Specifically in forestry, the human co-production tends to take the guise of management or silviculture. So all those cycles that we talked about in the previous slide come into play here. The other major modification of the ecosystem service cascade model is the introduction or recognition of values and their importance in this. Understanding that the values, that is what people consider important and why, are essential and have feedbacks with what is considered a benefit to people. And that as values change, what is considered a benefit can also change. And these values tend to color the possibilities for all this back cycle, what sort of pressures, management, and policy and interventions that we might implement in our forests to get the desired benefits. And I would propose that this is complementary to sort of the traditional definition. The very left-hand side here, the biophysical structures and processes and the pressures, management, and policies that we put in place to protect or manage those forest ecosystems are part of the art science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, quality of forests and woodlands. And then that is to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners and society on a sustainable basis. That's this right-hand side. What this adds is this explicit recognition of sort of the back loop nature of this and how values affect that art and science, and also that there are levels that are outside of our control between our management or manipulation of those ecosystems and the benefits that people receive, which may cast doubt on the controlling verb in the traditional definition. Now, one thing I didn't talk about in much detail in that last slide was values, but you may have noticed that I had 3 words listed under values: intrinsic, instrumental, and relational. If you've taken environmental ethics in the past, you might be familiar with instrumental values and intrinsic values. These stretch back to the German philosopher Kant, most notably. And instrumental values are usually those use values, things like market values, preferences, or utility flow to people. Whereas intrinsic values are the inherent moral values of something that's important as an end in itself, using the Kantian logic. Important distinctions between instrumental values and intrinsic values are that instrumental values are inherently substitutable. So the assumption is that if you have two things of value, that they could be reduced to common units like money, and you could then pay in equivalency to substitute that value. And in an instrumental sense, that would be equivalent. Whereas intrinsic values are non-substitutable. For example, it would be considered morally incorrect or incomprehensible to suggest a price for a human life, because a human life is considered to have intrinsic value. Another important difference is that instrumental values tend to refer to relationships between humans and nature, or humans in the forest in this case. And that's an instrumental relationship when we talk about instrumental values. So the forest is useful to people for specific reasons, whether it provides timber, other goods, other services. Whereas intrinsic values, or things that have intrinsic values, are considered to be important as ends in themselves, regardless of their relationship to humans. The forest is important for its own right, regardless of what values it might provide us. This is a perspective often endorsed by environmental groups who are opposed to resource extraction or active forest management. Now, these values in the context of silviculture, I would propose that often the objectives we set for forest management or silviculture are based on instrumental values. Things like optimizing timber production or return on investment. Even multiple uses tend to just be minimizing trade-offs between different instrumental or use values. Whereas intrinsic values in silvicultural context often take the form of constraints, whether it's having reserves, wilderness areas, increasing buffers. And I would propose even restoration efforts have a intrinsic value motivation behind them often, trying to restore ecosystems to the conditions they were prior to human influence, for example, for their own sake. So then the question becomes, what about this green square, relational values? Well, this is a new area of values that's been proposed in about the last 10 years or so. And what relational values are things that are important to living a good life, or eudaimonia. They're often associated with place-based values and responsibility and care values. They're non-instrumental relationships with nature. So it's easiest, I think, to explain relational values with an example. And for this crowd, I choose one with forestry context, which is if you have a forester that works in a community and his livelihood and his life is based on taking care of the forest, generating useful products for his community and society. And he identifies as a forester out in the woods, being able to do these things. If you said, well, tomorrow you're no longer going to be able to be a forester, we're not going to manage the forest, but we are going to pay you the same amount of money. We're going to subsidize your community with tax benefits for any lost income or tax revenue they might have. But you're going to go work at a desk job at an Amazon warehouse. I think we can all relate to there being a disparity there, even though that forester is receiving the same salary, the same benefits, and his community is receiving the same monetary compensation. There's still a real sense of loss because something that's constitutive of that person's identity as a forester is being taken away from them. And that would represent a relational value that they have with the forest and with the profession of being a forester. So what does relational values have to do with silviculture, or what would relational silviculture look like? And this is a sort of my first draft at thinking about this, or at least putting it into words. And I propose an acronym, CARE, which consists of C standing for communing, means being in the forest, listening to the forest. Seeking to understand the forest, this can be in a ecological, scientific way, or also in other forms of knowing and understanding. And also forming a community in and around the forest. So with other foresters, with other members who are recreating and using that forest, but also potentially with the forest itself, realizing that within that community that's built around the forest and its importance to communities for lots of different reasons, the forest is a character as well. Next is A for acceptance. And this means accepting the gifts of the forest. This is terminology and a way of thinking that's really leaning heavily into indigenous and local knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. But this idea that the forest or nature in general is providing things for us as gifts. So this means that we are still taking timber out of the forest. It's not a no-touch policy, but there's still management actively gathering some of those material goods that we need from the forest to meet society's demands. But it's not taking what we want or viewing it as a factory for timber where we control production, but rather realizing that it's a reciprocity that we have to give things to the forest in terms of care and management, and then we receive these gifts back. And accepting these gifts, the goods and services that we need from the forest is as important as the care that we give to the forest. And finally, accepting what the forest is, which is not to say that this is a push towards anthropomorphizing forests, but recognizing that forests aren't a single entity, that they are alien to us, but still in that alienness, there is potential for having a recognition of interactions with them that are beyond the idea of forests being simply a mode of production for natural resources. Reciprocation is for the R, and this means giving back and leaving more. So this is really in combination with acceptance, reframing forests as more than just a resource. By giving back, this could be silviculture that we normally practice, things like tending, thinning, regeneration. And leaving more, I think, really speaks to some of the things that ecological silviculture is promoting that Tony talked about in his first talk. More heterogeneous outcomes where we have legacies that are important to the habitat or continued functioning of the forest. And E stands for eudaimonia, which translates into the good life. And what I mean by eudaimonia here is that I think for the first three parts of the CAR to really work, there needs to be an embracement of these concepts and this approach and structure of thinking about silviculture and forest management that really becomes foundational to what it means to be a forester. So we can adopt this in education programs in our higher institutes of learning, in our forestry programs, and hopefully then it trickles up into companies who are managing forests and agencies who are managing forests that allow these principles of care, acceptance, and reciprocity to be defining of what it means to be a good forester, and therefore what it means to live a good life as a forester. And I think only with this idea of eudaimonia and that acceptance of identity with these concepts in managing forests can this be pushed forward on a really sustainable basis. So with that, I will defer questions till the end, but I did want to give a special thanks to both Klaus as well as Barbara Maraca, who was an important sounding board for this talk. Thank you.
So my name is Maria Genoviak. I'm the acting director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and of the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub. And our work is really helping understand how climate change can affect forest management and helping support people in making their decisions. And so in doing that, we work a lot with silviculturists and other types of forest managers and natural resources professionals. And so what I wanted to do is a little bit of perspective on providing options. And I think the earlier talks in this session have set this up really quite nicely. My presentation is titled No Single Answer, and this relates to some of the work when we're talking with natural resource professionals about that there isn't a single answer for climate change, and for people who come to us asking us what they should be doing in their forests as far as practitioners, it's really thinking about understanding the context of their situation. And so our single answer is always, it depends, and really thinking about the goals and management situation context of working on a particular land base that that particular manager is in, and being able to bring them tools and resources for this. And so, when we think about where someone is working, what they're trying to achieve, we know that the landscapes are so diverse in terms of regions, ecosystems, and forest types, and the land conditions, the climate pressures and stressors associated with a particular land base or a particular place, as well as Austin just set up, all of these values, management goals, other management decisions that go into how someone makes decisions on their particular land base for a particular client or an organization that they work for. And so our job is to really think about how do we keep this multifactorial sort of consideration of ideas at the fore of making decisions and thinking about how do we respond to climate change, but also prevent people from going into vapor lock in terms of just the mind-blowing nature of trying to balance an increasing number of values, of desires for a particular land base over an increasingly long period of time, or maintaining that long-term focus, adding in things like climate change and other changing conditions. And so there's not a single answer. And one of the resources and kind of the framework that we developed from this, going back to some work that we did with our very first silviculture workshop, is thinking about how do we identify sort of and provide a framework for thinking about climate adaptation actions that translate all the way from big ideas and theories about climate adaptation. So this could be resistance, resilience, transition being a framework that we use a lot, resist, accept, direct being another one, these big ideas about how do we adapt to climate change and how do we translate those down to the specific tactics and silvicultural implementation that we see on the ground. And we were seeing a real big gap in terms of being able to translate big ideas like talking about resilience or transformation of ecosystems, these really important subjects, but how do we actually get them into the practitioner's toolbox and implement them? And so to work through this, we developed a continuum of adaptation actions that range from these options, which are the biggest ideas, down through strategies and approaches that I'll be discussing more. And these are kind of these mid-level actions, and then allowing managers to pick and choose the tactics that are right for their particular situation. And so what we call menus, and so the menu is all the possible actions, and they're meant to be pick and choose. You're meant to pick and choose from them. They're not a checklist, but rather a robust set of ideas for managers to think through. And so at this point, we've developed more than 10 adaptation menus across a variety of natural resources topics, starting in forestry and working through a wide range of topics. And so depending on where you're at, some of these may be more interesting. I'm going to go into carbon in a moment. But the idea here is that these are based on the literature, combing the literature, identifying all the different actions that are out there in terms of scientific literature as well as practice, and trying to put some organization onto them into these compilations of ideas that people can use to identify actions that may make sense for them. And I won't be talking about the adaptation menu today, or the adaptation workbook today, but we do pair our menus with, which are ideas related to climate adaptation, with an adaptation workbook, which is an adaptive management process and a planning process for thinking about how to integrate climate change into your work. And there are other frameworks as well, but really the idea here is that by using the adaptation workbook and then these adaptation menus together, we can basically connect the dots from what a manager wants to do in terms of their particular management goals and objectives for a particular site, thinking through climate change impacts, the challenges and opportunities for their management, then identifying those actions that make sense for them, implementing those specifically for the context that they're working in, and then monitoring and ensuring that it works. And so in an ideal world, these are all connected so that even if you're starting at maybe looking at an adaptation action, a tactic, you could almost work backwards and see, is this working in terms of our logic? So it's helping people think about how to approach climate change in their work. And we've used this on hundreds of adaptation demonstrations, as well as using these tools and resources for the adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment. And so we have a really robust set of features on how to use these. It was hard to think about all of what to cover today, but I was asked to talk a little bit related to carbon, because with an increase in interest in climate change as a broader topic and increased recognition of needing to have short-term actions that have meaningful impacts on atmospheric greenhouse gases, there's been an increased thrust on natural climate solutions and carbon mitigation, and how do we use forests and other natural and working lands to provide benefits for reducing greenhouse gases and carbon from the atmosphere, sequestering more in terrestrial ecosystems. And forests have really taken on a much, really gained prominence for their ability to not only serve currently as the tremendous carbon sinks and stores that they are, but also to have this potential that if we're looking for increased mitigation opportunities for greenhouse gases, that we could do more forestry actions in the short term to be able to get those to sequester additional carbon to minimize the effects of, or reduce the effects of climate change. And so this work has really generated, some really big discussion in terms of how does forest carbon management and how does forest climate adaptation, how do these two things fit together? And depending on where you are in the particular country or in North America, the way that this dialogue is unfolding is happening in different ways in different places, but it's still really interesting in that a lot of times carbon management and adaptation are sometimes seen as being in this tug of war, or they're seen as being somehow mutually exclusive or problematic and challenging for each other. Certainly there have been documented trade-offs and really good papers thinking about how do we balance these different potential for co-benefits as well as trade-offs. And so one of the resources that we developed was a menu of adaptation strategies focused on forest carbon management, really thinking about if we have these two topics, what is the overlap between them? How can we kind of draw the forest, circle diagram that brings these two circles into alignment together. So this is work that's led by Todd Onsel at our team at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And I'm just going to briefly describe a few of these strategies and then a quick case study and then two quick thoughts. So basically, you can read the menu in terms of looking at what these are, but I wanted to just highlight that these strategies really range from being defensive that are really aligned with maybe more less intensive, more passive, or more lighter touch types of management actions that are going to really focus on sustaining ecological functions, maintaining those core functions of ecosystems. There are actions that are really focused in terms of thinking about how do we minimize carbon losses from natural disturbance. And then as we work through the menu, we start to see more actions oriented towards building resilience. These are really complementary with ideas of ecological silviculture. So how can we use natural processes to think about how we can restore and make systems better adapted for climate change in a way that's really supporting the functions of these ecosystems. And then, actions that are really really focused on how do we transform systems for those, high degree of carbon benefits that some landowners or some organizations may want, or thinking about if we're going to be restarting, after a disturbance or something, how do we implement actions that are going to have, how do we identify ways that forests can sequester more carbon into the future? And so we've tested this menu across a number of project areas. One that we have highlighted in some of our projects is work with the Green Mountain Audubon Center with Audubon Vermont in Northern Vermont, where we're really thinking about, can we bring together their mission goals as an organization of increasing bird habitat with adapting to climate change and carbon mitigation, and thinking about how do we do this in a place-based way. And so this was one of the examples of a place where we used the menu of strategies and approaches to identify actions. So on this figure, the left column are the approaches from the forest carbon, the menu for forest carbon management, and then how they would actually implement them in their particular management context. And so again, there's no single answer. Every landowner is going to have something different, but by stepping through these processes and by using these resources, we can help link people's actions to their climate impacts and to their particular response that they're trying to achieve. And so this becomes really important, because when it comes to climate change, it's really all about intentionality in terms of, can we think about how those management goals and objectives, those values that we're having in a particular place, how can we use those to address climate change impacts to get the intended outcomes? So one thought is, I just wanted to convey is, in terms of this work, that are the adaptation menus that we've developed to help managers connect the dots and give people vocabulary for how their management might be able to support their goals in the context of climate change. And then the other one related to this idea of novel silviculture is that one of the biggest values we found from these menus is that it also gives managers and practitioners and scientists a really great opportunity for thinking about what new ideas are out there. And so this is probably my most popular slide that I've ever presented, but it's one that I present a lot, saying, yeah, some of your actions are going to be the same stuff you do every day. It's great for climate change, but what are those tweaks? What are those new and different actions that you might take in this particular place? And, when we talk about, what are the wild and crazy things you may need to be considering given climate change, that's where we really see these new ideas related to novel silviculture, ideas that, I think really push our knowledge of how systems work and are really exciting for how to move forward. And so it's been really great to be able to provide people an opportunity to have that creativity and identify new ideas and actions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Austin. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this session. I'm going to hopefully complement what everybody else has already set up in this session, speaking specifically about forest health issues, and primarily from an insect and disease standpoint. So I'm going to set up with a framework first, and it's not a comprehensive framework, so there's going to be missing pieces if we were all to brainstorm this together, but just as a general framework, we have biotic damaging agents that we think about a lot, so insects and pathogens, other plants, and we often frame this in a dichotomy of native and non-native organisms, and we will often manage them differently or consider a different suite of management options, whether they're native or non-native, and whether we consider them invasive or not. And I think that as we move forward, we're going to need to reconsider that dichotomy, and hopefully that will become clear as I move through some examples. And then we have the abiotic factors out there as well. So climate change is one we think about all the time. And then that interacts with fire. We have moisture issues. You either have too much moisture or too little moisture, and that can really impact our biotic agents. And then things like nutrient issues and other site factors. And then there's interactions between these abiotic and biotic factors that drive a lot of disturbance patterns that we see in the landscape. And then we have individual trees that come with their own set of genetics and the microbiome and functional traits. And when we think about these, then we have to start considering, well, can we really look at silviculture as a single discipline, or do we need a lot of different disciplines to help inform us moving forward? And then we can scale up from that individual tree to stands and landscapes and the interactions between those. And we could even scale up further than that to the entire range of a species and think in really large scales. And then we have to think about the temporal scales as well. And then, of course, all the interactions and synergies between all of these different factors. And then we could make this even more complex by adding more arrows and interactions between everything. And I could continue to add arrows to show the complexity of our ecosystems. But really the underlying theme is that it's really complex out there, and we know a little bit about some of these factors, but we really don't know much about some of the other interactions and how the different scales affect each other. So, what about the microbiome of an individual tree is affecting its susceptibility to the biotic insects and pathogens that might cause mortality of that tree? And how do those interact with the abiotic factors that we're growing more and more concerned about? And as we continue to move organisms around the planet, and as climate continues to change, these are going to become more and more problematic. And we know that forest health issues are going to continue to increase. And this is a figure from a paper that was just published a few months ago, looking at tree mortality rates and how they've been globally increasing with the exception of the Congo Basin. They found a different trend, but a pretty concerning trend globally that we're all pretty aware of, that mortality rates are increasing. And it behooves us to think more about how we're managing for these forest health issues if we want to maintain trees and forests in our landscape, and how we think about those issues. So I want to talk about a couple of examples to kind of highlight these issues. And one is southwestern white pines. This is a species that I've been working on for over a decade now. It's a native to the southwestern US and most of Mexico, or a large part of Mexico. And we consider quite a few different damaging agents when we're thinking about management. Some of them are more important than others, though, historically. So in terms of native tree pathogens, we have dwarf mistletoe, we have white pine needlecast, we have armillaria root disease, and we have this other fungal pathogen called Atropelis canephila. And none of these have been major players in terms of tree mortality in the past. We also have some native insects, including mountain pine beetle and twig beetles. Mountain pine beetle does cause some mortality in the species, but not widespread outbreaks. So in terms of these native insects, again, we think about them, but we don't really consider them too much in terms of management. And then we have one non-native tree pathogen, white pine blister rust. So we do focus on this one a lot. And then we have abiotic concerns related to primarily wildland fire and drought considerations with the climate. And the climate situation in the range of the species is going to be warmer and drier. So drought is a major player. And then the interactions with fire have caused some pretty large scale fires that will take out whole populations of these trees in one fell swoop. So we've been largely focused on the right side of this slide. So we look at these white pine blister rust and wildland fire and drought, and how do we manage in the face of all of these things? And the species lives in the mixed conifer zone, and so it's interacting with other species in that forest type. However, in the last year or so, we've been seeing a lot of mortality, and we don't have this quantified, so it's anecdotal at this point, but armillaria root disease and the Atropelis, both natives that are out there that we've not really been concerned about in the past, causing mortality of small trees, so in the understory and the subcanopy. So these are not mortality events that are going to be picked up by things like aerial surveys looking for overstory mortality because they're in the understory. So that's a concern, and I think going to be a growing concern. Okay, so we've been focused on the wrong issues now, potentially. We have to include more issues. So how will that change what we recommend for management? And what are we going to do about this? And what other organisms are out there that we don't know about? I'm studying one species out of a lot. So that's concerning. So a couple of other emerging issues that are along the same lines. So the theme here is that there's these native organisms out there that have been there, the trees evolved with them, and as the conditions shift, we're going to see a lot more mortality from these organisms, and we may not know much about them at all. And this next example is a really good one for that. So Emery Oak is another southwestern species, and we don't know a lot about the ecology of the species in general. It's not a commercial tree species. We don't use it for timber. It has very high cultural value for the Western Apache nations. It was a primary food source for them. And several years ago, they raised concerns about observations that the species wasn't regenerating well enough. And so they've been working with the US Forest Service to do some restoration strategies based on those concerns. And then they've been working with some scientists to implement Western science to look at the demography of the species along the way. In the past year or two, there's a brand new decline caused by this Biscoxnia fungus that is very concerning. This is probably a native species. We don't know much about it at all, and it is causing widespread mortality of this tree. So we don't know much about the tree. We don't know much about this new pathogen causing the decline. And yet managers in the southern part of Arizona, where this species is most abundant, are already trying some different management strategies, silvicultural strategies in landscape to try and increase tree vigor in the hopes that it will work. So they're taking some risks there, which is going to be one of my final points. And then the last example is just Aspen issues across the West. We've been kind of focused on Aspen in little regional areas and looking at regional issues, but I think we're going to take a landscape scale look at Aspen across the entire West on Thursday in a special session. So if you're interested in these issues, I encourage you to join us for the special session on Thursday morning. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up and think about how I think we need to maybe make some changes and then also keep some of our existing strategies in place moving forward. We need to incorporate added risks. So silviculturists don't like to try new things that are untested, especially at an operational level. But I think we're going to have to. As these new issues arise, we're not going to have time to do anything but try some things, or we risk losing species or stands as a whole. This will absolutely require operational monitoring. This is another thing that we're not very good at doing. We put treatments in the landscape and we're not very good at monitoring before and after. And so if we're going to try new things in the landscape that are untested, we need to monitor them to see how effective they are. This will require institutional changes as well, because we also don't provide a lot of support for risk-taking, depending on which institution you work for. So our managers need our support. More demonstration areas are going to be helpful. I don't think they're going to be the solution because they're not going to be broad enough in scope. We need larger scale changes, but they'll be helpful. And then workshops that bring managers and scientists together more. I think these are somewhat common now, but they need to be even more common because the managers are not reading the literature. We need to get our science out to the managers directly, and workshops are one way to do that. We also need research to go along with this, right? We need to do research on these novel events, look at species analogs and functional traits that we can, as we need to shift species, we can figure out what might replace species and look at interactions between species as well. And then relationship building is something that we're also in the past maybe haven't been as good at, particularly with Indigenous communities and using their knowledge and asking them to come and help us. And then science communication skills is another thing that we really need to build on and acknowledge that our emotions and objectivity, we have emotions, we're people, so we're not always as objective, and that can actually help us build relationships with the public and build trust, because the public is also not going to like these riskier treatments that are not necessarily based on Western science at the beginning. And then just a few final points. I think place-based, Maria mentioned this in her talk, is absolutely critical. We've been doing this. We need to continue to do this. And we need to make sure that we're asking the managers to watch for things in the field, like listen to them in the field. Like they come back and say, this isn't unusual. We need to think about what's happening out here and rely on their critical thinking skills as well. We can't take everything and model it out empirically. And then I'm just going to list a bunch of disciplines here that my final thought is that we need an interdisciplinary approach moving forward. We can't do it all as silviculturists. We absolutely have to bring others into the fold, both from the management side and the research side. And with that, we'll end. Thank you.
So I'm Dr. Marcella Wimura-Campioni. I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm grateful to be a part of this session. Thank you, Austin. And I'm hoping that what I'm going to present on builds on a lot of the thoughts and ideas of how we think about opportunities for critical thinking in silviculture education. So I'm grateful that I'm at the end because we've heard so many amazing thoughts about opportunities and needs. And as we think about the generations moving through different stages of education, how can we provide those opportunities for people moving from their undergrad or graduate careers into these management roles? How do we provide opportunities for them to think critically and think about these issues in new and exciting ways? And so I'm also grateful that Austin provided the full definition, but I want to pull this out. Again, silviculture is the art and science. And I like these definitions when art comes first, because I think there's a lot of ideas of how we define art and what that feels like. And there's an emotional sense with which multiple authors mentioned, multiple presentations mentioned that emotional part, and art and creativity, that's an emotion. And that's part of what we have within this discipline, not only within our science and our research and these other aspects, but also thinking about how we incorporate that art into teaching. And so as we think about teaching, and that definition of science and art, it can be one of those lenses of like, we can teach the science, and the science that builds on these foundational concepts of how species interact and what that looks like individually and together, and then build from how they're interacting to what that means as they grow and develop, and how species grow and how that shift in growing space can relate to information about how we manage them, and utilizing different tools and techniques, and especially as COVID has shifted how we teach and what gets covered in a conventional lecture versus what maybe gets covered through a YouTube or a flip lecture, and thinking about how those pieces of science keep building, again, from this foundational aspects to the types of management, and then thinking about how those types of management get implemented into tools, and tools like the Gingrich stocking diagram or stand density index, or all these pieces. These are fundamental concepts within silviculture that I think we're doing a really great job as academic silviculturists and applied forest ecologists of covering how these pieces fit together. And we're also incorporating these new and emerging concepts of adaptive approaches and continuous forest inventory, and how these pieces build, and providing skills to our students in thinking about these really quantitative tools, as well as these conceptual bases which these quantitative tools are built on. However, that science is just one piece of our discipline. It's also thinking about that art, and that art comes through lots of different lenses. And this is a recent harvest in northern Minnesota, and seeing the complexity and the differences within the environment, within the small photo, both at the short and broader landscape scale. Thinking about the beauty and the environment that comes from a down dead piece of wood, and the moss and the fungi and the leaves and the regeneration surrounding it. To thinking about those experiences that silviculture is an applied discipline. And one of the things that is core to our discipline is having students experience that and take in these experiences. So this is a picture in northern Minnesota of students within their first weeks of starting within the forestry program at the University of Minnesota. They're out in the field and experiencing these pieces. And so that emotion, that art, that creativity is what maybe brought a lot of us to silviculture, allows us to connect with this discipline. But as we see, like the question, novel silviculture for a novel world, how do we work to train current and future students? What does that look like? And so I'm not going to go into all the detail about this, but I want to highlight some of this opportunity with this assignment. And the citation is here, the full rubric is here within that paper, and goes into a lot of the details. But the basis of this is let them create. And so this is the final project I've been using for a little bit of time now that really focuses on utilizing technology that has become very commonplace, our cell phones. And students develop, as their final project, a case study and a silviculture prescription that they get to choose. They get to develop what that looks like for them. And so there's some very broad guidelines, and the broad guidelines is use the scientific theories and foundation and management aspects, and then tell me a story. How do you want to create this? And so I want to highlight a few examples of what this is and how folks have used this in the past. So one of my favorite ones happened this last year, And maybe some of you are more familiar with Minecraft than others. This was my first experience with Minecraft, was from the students project. But they implemented a silvicultural prescription within their Minecraft universe to reduce density in their forest ecosystem, to reduce zombie habitat. So they were using density management tools and thinking about thinning and regeneration and these regeneration harvests, and pairing that together with how you get a density level and canopy level that creates habitat that is not suitable for zombies. And so we got to see that in action. They took us through the universe, they told us about the current levels, and then implemented a thin from below to open up the canopy and reduce zombies. We also, a few years ago, we saw, those of you maybe who remember Never Ending Story, we saw a student present on regenerating eastern cottonwood for falcor habitat. And so falcor is this large mythical being in Never Ending Story, and the student paired what falcor needed with the same habitat suitability as bald eagles. And so they used the HSI, or Habitat Suitability Index, and added a caveat that falcor also needs children's laughter. And so along the upper Mississippi River, there's a lot of spaces that have trails and are really heavily recreated. And so they paired, how do we manage to increase and maintain large diameter cottonwoods, which are important for bald eagles, as well as falcor, with pairing that with recreation, and how do we build this together? And so they were using these scientific theories, the foundational aspects of silvics, of eastern cottonwood, as well as growth and development and stand dynamics, to think about a mythical being. And then another example is, many students take the opportunity to connect with family lands, lands that have a special place in their heart, lands that they grew up connecting with, and think about, from this class, what might they shift about that? And maybe that's, for some students, it's thinking about trees that they remember planting as a young child, and thinking about, what does that look like now? And what do I want this to look like in 20 or 30 years? For some, it means connecting with other relatives. And for others, it means going back to these places that under one lens, they saw, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. And as they look back on it, oh, I see buckthorn, I see all these other invasives that are maybe impacting the regeneration of a long-lived conifer or something else. And so it provides an opportunity for them to consider, how do these what is my relationship to these special places? And so at the heart of this, it's letting students create. And it's letting students create based on science, but without these constraints, without some of the constraints that Kristen mentioned about logistics within an organization, without market demands, without equipment limitations, without those resources that we know are part of the real world that they are going to be entering. But if we want students and our future natural resource management to think creatively and be able to consider novel solutions, we need to give them the opportunity to try that out before they move into these structures and organizations that have sometimes very big constraints. And so climate change is a massive threat and impact. And this generation that are entering college and will continue to enter college, that's been a component. And many of these headlines we see about climate change and are about climate change take a negative lens, because there's big problems. A forest can really provide opportunities. And silviculture can be, sorry, one of those lenses. And so I'm going to finish. Silviculture is an art and a science, and we can encourage students to consider both. Thank you.